Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers out there, I'd like to welcome everyone to this discussion about the legacy of the Italian resistance. The anniversary of the liberation of Rome is nearing, and I thought it was important, as does the World War II Museum, thinks it's important that we also consider the role that Italians played in fighting fascism, in fighting against the Third Reich's occupation forces, and really considering the longer struggle that Italian anti-fascists waged against the Mussolini dictatorship. To do that, we are so fortunate today to have Professor Carlo Ginzburg as our guest. Carlo, welcome to this discussion. Many of our viewers might know you for your many publications in the fields of late medieval and early modern European history, works like The Night Battles, Witchcraft and Agrarian Cults in the 16th and 17th centuries, The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller. I should note, by the way, that some former colleagues of mine at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville formed a band called The Cheese and the Worms, Professor Ginzburg, in honor of your book, and some other titles like Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, The Judge and the Historian, Clues, Myths, and the Historical Method, and many other publications as well. But Professor Ginzburg, I think many of our viewers know you for your work in the fields of late medieval, early modern history, but may not know your own direct connections to the history of anti-fascism, the role the Second World War played in a very personal way. And I think it's important that we consider this story. It's a really remarkable story, and we really appreciate you being with us here today to discuss that. And so where I'd like to begin in our discussion is to talk about your family, particularly your parents, Leone and Natalia Ginzburg. Could you tell me about the background of your parents before they met?
Well, their background was very different, but they both came from Jewish families, non-religious Jewish families. My father was born in Odessa, and he moved to Italy first as a child and then with his family after the 1917 revolution. So the family moved first to Berlin, and then they moved to Torino, Italy. So my father was, let's say, grew up in Italy, and he became an Italian citizen in 1931. This is important for his political commitment because he decided to commit himself to the anti-fascist underground resistance only when he became an Italian citizen. So in 1932. My mother's family was different. I mean, her father, Giuseppe Levi, was a well-known, internationally known biologist. Three of his pupils received a Nobel Prize, which is very unusual. And my mother was born in Palermo because my grandfather was teaching in Palermo in Sicily at that time. But then my mother grew up in Torino. So let's say at a certain moment, both my father and my mother were in Torino, and so they met.
Oh, well, that's really interesting that you mentioned your father. It was really until 1931 when he became a citizen that he does make the decision to get directly involved in opposition to the Mussolini regime. But your father had a promising academic career at that time. I mean, he was in his early 20s at that point. What happened to this career?
Well, I mean, he was certainly very precocious, and he started to write on Russian literature, to translate Russian novels, Gogol into Italian, later Pushkin. He became a libero docente, and he was allowed to teach at the University of Torino. And so he started a very promising academic career. But when he refused to swear the oath of allegiance to the fascist regime, his academic career was over. And this was in 1934, and immediately after he was arrested because he had been involved in anti-fascist conspiracy. Now, his dissertation was not on Russian literature. He was teaching Russian literature, but his dissertation was on Guy de Maupassant, so on French literature. And he went to Paris in 1932 with Benedetto Croce, the most prominent Italian philosopher at that time. And there was a very close personal relationship. I mean, my father was very young. Croce was, recognized as the most important Italian philosopher at that moment. His work was translated into all kinds of languages. But Croce used to spend some months in Piedmont, and so he met my father, and there was this relationship. Actually, Croce insisted with my father, saying that he had to swear the oath of allegiance, but my father refused. So Croce was saying, Croce's argument was a political argument, but there was a sort of moral commitment which explains my father's denial to Croce's pressure. So in 1932, they went to Paris, and my father met Carlo Rosselli. Rosselli came also from a Jewish background. He was an early opponent of Mussolini's regime. He was sent to confinement in the island of Lipari, but he succeeded in leave Lipari, and he went to, there was a real dangerous enterprise, and he was able to come to Paris. And so he brought with him a work which he had written, Rosselli had written in Lipari, Socialismo Liberale, Liberal Socialism, which was first published in French in 1930 and only much later in Italian. So the title is, says something about Rosselli's, political perspective, the idea of, on the one hand, criticizing the Socialist Party, the Italian Socialist Party, and socialism as an ideology, as something which was, in a way, unable to resist effectively to a new phenomenon like fascism. But later in his life, Rosselli and his brother were murdered in 1937. But his political commitment was violently broken. But at the very end of his life, when he became, Rosselli was involved in the Spanish Civil War, fighting against Franco. Rosselli became closer to the Communist Party. My father's attitude was very different. In fact, when we are talking about that group, Liberty and Justice, which was, and Rosselli was the leader of the group, we have to make a distinction between, the group based in Paris, Rosselli and other exiles living there, and the Italian connection. There were links insofar as, the Italian representatives, underground representatives of Liberty and Justice, including my father, was the most prominent representative of that group in Turin, were, spreading leaflets and propaganda press, taking this from Paris. But as we can see from the articles written under pseudonyms by my father, for instance, in the Quaderni di Giustizia e Libertà, the underground journal, which was, let's say, related to the Justice and Liberty group, we can see that what was remarkable in the Italian contributions was a close attention to Italian society and Italian history. So in a way, Rosselli was very much open to, well, I would say, international experiences. Living in Paris, Paris was still, one could say, in a sense, the capital of the 20th century, paraphrases of Walter Benjamin. But even if, let's say, the political strength of France was weaker and weaker, but still, I mean, it was an intellectual and political center, very important. But Rosselli was thinking about, let's say, actions which could have an impact on the Italian public opinion. My father's attitude was different. Underground attitude, trying to construct links which could act underground. But even this attempt did not succeed. My father was arrested in 1924. In fact, there is a link between, let's say, my mother's family and my father at that moment, because the group was discovered because one of my mother's brothers, Mario Levi, was taken by the fascist police at the border of Italy, and he succeeded in jumping into the river, and he went to France, and much later he was involved in the French resistance and so on. But at that moment, even the, let's say, the leader of the Justice and Liberty group in Turin, meaning my father, was arrested. And so there was a trial. He was sentenced, 4 years of jail. After 2 years, which he spent in Civitavecchia, there was a general amnesty. And so he went back to Torino. But, his academic career was over. His political career was over because he was closely surveilled and so on. So what he did was to commit himself to intellectual life, not only as a scholar, as a philologist, but also he founded with Giulio Einaudi the Einaudi Publishing House, which was the most important non-fascist, actually anti-fascist publishing house in Italy in the 30s, and then after the war and so on. So, in a way, both my at that time he's also met my mother. So they married in 1938. In that year, the racist laws introduced by the fascist regime implied, among other things, the loss of the Italian nationality in the case of my father. He became an apolide, no citizenship.
A stateless person, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which was something very painful for him. But as I know from, let's say, indirect witnesses, he was extremely lucid. He was looking at what was happening in Europe and Germany, and his vision of the future was absolutely realistic and tragic. I never.
If I could just jump in, right? Did your father, as opposed to Rosselli, did he see the prospect of toppling the Mussolini regime? Like this is going to be a long, difficult process. The dictatorship was so entrenched, or was he more optimistic that people could be organized, that discontent against the regime could be brought together, could be mobilized in a way that could bring the regime down?
Well, I mean, if we may start from this, let's say, kind of basic opposition between an optimistic attitude and a pessimistic attitude, I would say that Rosselli was more optimistic.
Mm.
My father believed in a sort of um, long, slow underground opposition, because he was very well aware that the roots of fascism in Italian society were very deep. There is a very striking article written by my father under pseudonym in the Quaderni di Giustizia e Libertà, which is called Viatico ai nuovi fascisti, sort of, let's say, viatico, well, it's a sort of way of saying to the new members of the fascist party, in other words, people who became members under compulsion, because this became a requisite not only for let's say university professors, but I mean in all kind of public activities and so on. And so my father said, wrote this article, saying, well, we can understand that our attitude, our choice has been different, but we have to understand why those people are unable to resist to this compulsion. And I found this striking both from a moral and a political point of view. In other words, from a moral point of view, saying, okay, I made a different choice, it's much more dangerous, but I mean, I have to understand this, your choice, which has been a choice under compulsion. And then from a political point of view, the idea that even the political elite, so to speak, the anti-fascist underground elite, had to keep a link, a connection with the Italian society at large. And I think this was very important. So, I mean, you can see in perspective how, let's say, there was an attempt which was different from the attempt of the Italian Communist Party. My father was never a communist. Actually, I I was able to know a person who was a underground communist worker in the village where my father was sent in internal exile in 1940. When Italy entered the war with Nazi Germany, my father was sent to internal exile in a little village in the Abruzzi. And there he met a young worker who was a communist, and he became close to my father. And after the war, this man, Vittorio Giorgi, a very brave man, who was able to help my mother and the children, including myself, to leave to Rome. I will go back to this. This man, Vittorio Giorgi, told me that he had conversations with my father about what was going on during the war. And my father said that the real division between us, we are both against fascism, but for me, the issue of liberty is crucial. And this is something which is outside the perception of the communists. Now, after the war, Vittorio Giorgi, this worker, became the mayor of Pizzoli and then a member of the parliament. And I had a very moving conversation with him about his recollections of my father and so on.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating that for your father, the issue of political freedom was crucial for any leftist politics, and the perception, obviously, that the Communist Party, which at the time these parties were all Stalinist parties, right? I mean, these were, largely, even though the rank and file, there was obviously much greater difference. It's interesting to note that for your father, this issue of liberty was really central for him.
Yeah.
Really
On the other hand, I mean, the relationship between the Justice and Liberty Group and the Communist Party changed along the years, because at the beginning, the Communist Party was, Italian Communist Party was very critical of justice and liberty. But then after 1935, when, let's say, the Comintern strategy changed, even the attitude towards justice and liberty as a group changed.
This is, you're referring right to the Popular Front strategy, right? A broad kind of anti-fascist opposition, liberals, moderate socialists, communists, even occasionally anarchists, together, working together in some way to fight fascism. And your father, obviously, that organization had been part of that, and that you pointing out here, the Communist Party became more responsive to justice and liberty to then. You mentioned already, though, about your father in internal exile. Could you say more about that phase and what happened to your family during that time?
So my father was sent to internal exile, and he was sent to Pizzoli, this little village. And my mother reached him in a couple of months with, let's say, myself. I was 1 year old. My brother Andrea, who was a few months old. And then my sister was born in L'Aquila when we were in that village. So actually, my earliest childhood memories are related to that place, that village. Very vivid memories. And it was a very moving moment in 1960. 1960 was an important year in Italian political life, because for the first time there was a neo-fascist party who became was included in a government led by the Christian Democratic Party. And so there was a kind of revolt in Genoa when, let's say, this neo-fascist party was supposed to have a congress in Genoa. And so there were, let's say, clashes, people killed by the police and so on. And after that, the government collapsed. And there was a kind of anti-fascist, let's say, re-emergence of anti-fascist memories with, let's say, as a how can I say, as an element of contemporary life, implying a turning point vis-a-vis that, let's say, choice to the right made by the Christian Democratic Party. So at that moment, that was the summer of 1960, immediately after the collapse of the government, of the center to the right government, let's say. So the mayor of Pizzoli decided to put a plaque in where we lived when my father was in internal exile. And so there was this very moving event. And I remember that Carlo Levi, who had been, let's say, involved in the same Justice and Liberty group with my father, was there, and he made a speech. And Vittorio Foa, who had been also involved in the same group and spent 9 years in jail, he was very close to my father, also came. And I remember that moment because, there was this kind of link between, let's say, anti-fascist memories embodied by the presence of those people and the village where we lived. At the same time, and I remember I had a conversation with Vittorio Foa about this, because Carlo Levi at that moment wrote an article saying, we, talking about what happened in Genoa, we are witnessing a kind of a second resistance. And Vittorio Foa was not convinced at all. I remember a long conversation with him, and he said, you know, what is so remarkable in those events is that those young men, those young people who went to the streets were in fact fighting also against their own parties. This is something which took place outside the parties. So I could see how Carlo Levi was looking back and Vittorio Foa was looking forward, I would say.
So that's fascinating. In fact, the connections between the war years and then the post-war period and concerns about a neo-fascist resurgence. It would be interesting, Professor Ginzburg, in a different format to think about about West Germany, about Japan, about the Axis powers, and how the 1960s there's this similar concerns there about right-wing resurgence. But I wanted to ask you, getting back to the war years, about 1943, obviously for Leone and Natalia Ginzburg, for yourself, your family, and for Italians, this is a really decisive year. The defeat of fascist Italy in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily by the Allies, then the invasion of Italy proper, the toppling of the Mussolini dictatorship internally, and the surrender that's carried out, etc. That was such a year for Italy, and I think many Americans can lose track of that. Could you talk about how 1943 was really decisive for your family?
So, I mean, the collapse of the fascist regime in July 25 implied, I mean, there was a completely change in the political landscape, and my father immediately decided to go to Rome. So he went to Rome, and we, my mother and the three children, reached him. I mean, on the track of the German army. So we were, let's say, disguised, and the village, starting from Vittorio Giorgi, the communist worker I mentioned before, helped us to leave the village, and I have a very vivid memory of that moment, leaving Pizzoli. And so we went to Rome, and but after, I mean, after September 8th, there was the occupation, the German occupation of Rome, and my father, under a false identity, became the director of an underground anti-fascist journal, Italia Libera, which was related to the Partito d'Azione. What I didn't say is that when my father was in internal exile in Pizzoli, he was able at a certain moment to travel to Turin. And so when, let's say, the fascist regime collapsed, there was a Congress of the Federalist Party in Milan. And so the idea of, let's say, establishing a group looking at Europe as in a large perspective. Mm-hmm. So even this journal, the underground journal, which he directed, was, let's say, stressing the European dimension, and also, let's say, stressing something which was put forward by my father in a very dramatic circumstance when he was in jail and he had been tortured. And he met Sandro Pertini, the socialist leader who, after the war, became president of the Italian Republic. And in his souvenir, in his recollections, Pertini said that he had met my father, who had been tortured, and my father said, above all, we shall not hate the Germans. In other words, making a distinction, an explicit distinction between the Nazi regime and the Germans, which is something which I can explain in a sort of perspective leading to Europe. In other words, it was again, I think, a sort of, you can see a moral dimension and a political dimension in this. So
really distinguishing, as I think you're pointing out, between the dictatorship, the Hitler dictatorship, and the German people, that you should not conflate the two or to see them as identical, but they're real distinctions there. And it sounds like your father was thinking about a kind of Europeanist perspective. I'm assuming a kind of social democratic or socialist Europeanism of some sort. Is that fair to say? Is that what he's thinking in 1943, 44?
Well, it's difficult to say because I can reconstruct his political attitudes indirectly. On the one hand, there is the European dimension, the federalist perspective, and then there was his stress as far as the Italian history was concerned of the autonomies, let's say, against a centralist attitude. And I can see how this perspective could be combined with a sort of European perspective. So I would say, but here I'm interpreting, that in the long run, what would be, let's say, weaker would have been the state dimension vis-a-vis a sort of utopian European perspective and the dimension related to local realities, which in Italy was so important. So one of the articles actually written by my father under a pseudonym in the Quaderni di Giustizia e Libertà was about political autonomy as a, let's say, ideal perspective, and also as something related to, let's say, local administrations. So the multiple reality of Italian life, as opposed to sort of central and a bit artificial dimension, which was in fact imposed by the fascist regime. So it's difficult to make a choice. On the other hand, when he was a young man, my father wrote, not under a pseudonym, that's interesting, a review of the first volume of the History of Russian Revolution by Trotsky. And it was a very sympathetic and critical review at the same time. But certainly full of admiration for Trotsky's personality. This was, I think, in 1931, but I can be wrong. I should check this. So let's say the idea that there was something very lively in the socialist tradition, and I think that this is something which he said over and over in those articles under a pseudonym, something related to the workers' councils. So here you can see a link with Gramsci. In other words, a very specific interpretation of the socialist legacy related to the Italian experience, and especially to, let's say, Torino once again. And this was mediated by a very important figure in, let's say, the anti-fascist legacy, meaning Piero Gobetti. My father was unable to meet him. He died, he was, let's say, addressed under he was practically murdered by the fascist squads. But Gobetti left a very important legacy, and my father was very well aware of his link with this tradition. And so Gobetti and Gramsci, Gobetti reinterpreted Gramsci. In other words, the experience related to the Consigli Operai in Turin as a sort of experience of political autonomy against a centralist vision. And so there was, Gobetti said, a liberal dimension within the communist tradition. Now, liberal is a word which is very difficult to translate because, there are so many different versions of liberalism. But in fact, Gobetti's, collected his articles, and the title was La Rivoluzione Liberale. So something revolutionary within a reinterpretation of liberalism. And I think that my father was certainly very close to this. Although, I mean, he reinterpreted this because times were changing and so on and so forth.
That's really interesting that his interest in the kind of tradition of workers' councils, the kind of early phase of the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm assuming that Trotsky's history, like the interest in reviewing Trotsky's history, would be looking at that early phase when the notion of Soviet democracy was posed as a real alternative before the kind of top-down, centralized measures really took place in the Soviet Union. And I think that's very important for us to remember about your father's politics and many of his peers, was this interest in autonomy and workers' councils and democratic experimentation. I wanted to just, in this case, Professor Ginzburg, ask it's a painful question about what happened to your father.
My father was, as I said, he was the director of this underground journal, and he was arrested. He went to the typography where the journal was printed, and he was arrested and recognized because there were files with his photos. So he had false identity, but he was recognized, and so. First, he was put in the section of the Roman jail controlled by the Italian fascists. But then when he was recognized and being Jewish, he was transferred to the German section. There he was tortured, and he died in 1944 on February 5th. And he wrote a letter to my mother the night before, and he was very well aware that there was no hope. Although, it was this sudden death, but and also my mother was able to see him only after his death. And my mother and the children left Rome for a while, and so we went to Florence, where my mother's sister lived, and so I remember, being, let's say, hidden in a little place near Florence with my mother and my mother's mother, and the Germans were there, and actually they were retreating. So I still remember both the retreat and the arrival of the English tanks. But before the arrival of the English tanks, my mother's mother was the only non-Jewish member of the family. I didn't know that. She told me, if somebody would ask you, what's your name? You should answer, my name is Carlo Tanzi, which was the name of my grandmother's father. I didn't know that. And I still remember my maternal grandmother writing this name, Carlo Tanzi, on a book I was, they had been reading to me at that moment. Still remember the title, Il più felice bambino del mondo, the happiest child in the world. And much later, I thought at that moment I became Jewish. It was, this is something which I will never forget. It was it's a bit like, the argument about becoming Jewish under the pressure of persecution, which was an argument which, I came across in Sartre's La Réflexion sur la question juive, and I was perplexed on a general level, but in my case, it certainly worked. So, and then yeah, well, we survived, and then we went to Turin. Yeah, and my mother started to work in the Einaudi publishing house. I mean, she had been writing also using a pseudonym. So, her first novel, La strada che va in città, was published under a pseudonym, Alessandra Torni in parte.
Mhm.
And at that moment, my father was revising, actually rewriting a translation of the Italian translation of Tolstoy's War and Peace. And I was, when I read for the first time Tolstoy's War and Peace, possibly the novel who made the deepest impression on me ever, there was an introduction signed with an asterisk. And this was my father, because being Jewish, he was unable to use his name. So, I mean, my mother, we went to Turin, and my mother started to work in the Einaudi publishing house, and she published books over there. I mean, she had actually, my father convinced, but that was in the mid 30s, convinced Giulio Einaudi to buy the rights for the Italian translation of Marcel Proust. And he convinced my mother to start to translate Proust's Recherche, which she did when we were in Pizzoli, in that village. And then, so let's say I can still remember when I was a child, my mother coming back from work with Einaudi and bringing books. So I saw Proust, which later I read in French, but I still remember the books of Proust in Italian. And brought by my mother and so on. So, I mean, I think that, let's say, there was this, well, first of all, the connection with Einaudi as something which was related both to my father and my mother. And I was, let's say, extremely happy to publish my first books with Einaudi. Actually, in a collection which had been, let's say, conceived by my father. So, yeah.
So that's incredible. And your mother, I think, for many of our viewers, may not be aware, Professor Ginzburg, that your mother, Natalia Ginzburg, became one of the leading literary figures in post 1945 Italy, and there's been a recent, I think, reissue of Family Lexicon, an English translation of her famous novel All Our Yesterdays. There's so many of these books as well as essays. She was such an important figure, and was involved in the Communist Party. I think you've noted elsewhere for many years, and like your father, literature and activism, literature and politics were very much related for your mother as well. They were not they were interconnected, and I think it's important for our viewers to know that your mother was had a long career after World War II. As not only involved in the publishing industry, but as a remarkable writer all our own. But noting our time here, I just wanted to ask a few things in kind of our final 5 to 10 minutes about your post-war career, Professor Ginzburg, and how that connected to the experiences you described for us. And I just want to note a few of them. You've mentioned in 1959 as a student in Pisa. And of course, you would go on to have such an impressive academic career at the University of California, Los Angeles, at University of Pisa. But you've noted that in 1959 in Pisa, as a student, you had a kind of triple decision that you made that was really important for your future. Could you tell us about that triple decision?
Well, I mean, I was a student at the Scuola Normale, which is a kind of a twin institution with the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Both of them were founded by Napoleon. And so it's kind of college, something very unusual in Italy. But so I was there in the in the library, and I was looking at some books, and then suddenly I made that triple decision, meaning trying to become a historian, trying to work on witchcraft trials as a topic of research, trying to recover, to rescue the voices and attitudes of the victims. And retrospectively, I realized that I was completely unaware of the methodological difficulties which were involved in the idea of using the archives of repression in order to rescue the attitudes of the victims. And I think that, let's say, my concern for methodology was the result of this. Maybe it would have emerged anyway. But what I did not realize at that time, and I found this retrospectively paradoxical, was let's say, the connection between the idea of rescuing the attitudes of the victims and my own experiences as a Jewish child during the war. And I realized this much, much later. I'd also published The Cheese and the Worms after my first book on witchcraft, The Night Battles. And I remember a conversation just in front of the Einaudi publishing house in Torino. And an art historian, Paolo Fossati, was working there. He said, well, but that's obvious. I mean, you are Jewish, and so you work on witches and heretics. And I thought, yeah, that's so obvious. But how could I not be aware of this connection? And I think that my, let's say, argument is that sort of post-Freudian argument is that there was a sort of unconscious strategy in this lack of awareness. In other words, in order to make this connection, which was so deep, more effective, I should have been unaware of this. But who knows? In any case, I was not aware. And so, but I mean, it was complicated because later I realized that besides this emotional contiguity with the victims, there was also a troubling intellectual contiguity between myself and the inquisitors. And I published an article, first in Swedish, and then it was translated into many languages, The Inquisitor as Anthropologist. But this is a different topic.
Right, that's been a much discussed article, but you're pointing to a very interesting kind of self-knowledge that you arrived at, that, as you described, it was a kind of unconscious strategy, and then eventually there was this realization that you aligned yourself, your own experiences, a Jewish family in fascist Italy, the Nazi Germany's occupation, that there was your later research and the victims in the witchcraft trials and trials for heresy, that there was a real continuity there. And that's interesting about how you came to see that. You're kind of to look back retrospectively over your long career and to see, yes, there were these direct links there. It's fascinating.
But continuity and discontinuity. So I wrote years ago an article entitled Our Words and Theirs. So, I mean, there are the words of the historian and then the words of the actors. And so there is this very intricate connection. And I argued, we start as historians with questions which are inevitably anachronistic. But then we may succeed in rescuing the voices of the actors. Actually, it's a reworking of a distinction which has been made by an American linguist, anthropologist, and Protestant missionary, Kenneth Pike, the distinction between ethic and imic. So I reworked this, but in any case. So there is continuity and discontinuity as well.
And that's such an interesting point about where it is continuous and where there are real breaks. as well. And I think that could require a conversation all its own. But I thought that a good place to conclude, Professor Ginzburg, is your thoughts after discussing all of that with us. What do you think people, especially here in the United States, who may not know that much about it, what do you think is the legacy or legacies of the Italian resistance?
Well, I mean, the Italian constitution says that Italy is born from the resistance. So this is written in the constitution. On the other hand, I think it would be wrong to think that the legacy of the resistance is shared by everybody in Italy. Not at all. It's still a political issue. So, I mean, there is a divisive element, inevitably. Because after all, I mean, there are, let's say, parties, not only in Italy, who reclaim themselves of a legacy which is just the opposite. And there is a growing racism, also growing anti-Semitism, and so on. And so, I mean, we have to be aware of this. And so it's important to, let's say, look at the legacy of the resistance in a, I would say, non-mythical perspective. So we have to work on this in a critical way, but to be aware, in this case, of both the continuity and the discontinuity. But also the continuity is important.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, that there needs to be a critical history, a critical historical treatment of the Italian resistance that includes a range of groups. You mentioned obviously Justice and Liberty and the Communist Party. There are obviously other groups we just simply don't have time to address, but it's such a complex but important history. And it's definitely crucial for us to remember when we're thinking about the liberation of Italy from fascism, about the role Italians played in that very liberation. So let me thank you, Professor Ginzburg, for taking the time to talk with us today. It's such an amazing story that you've told us and given us so much to consider. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've been very grateful. Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.